I do want to talk a lot more about the situation in general here, so let's bring in Janatan Sayeh, a research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Great to be with you. Good morning.
Good morning. Well, first off, I do actually want to ask you about that statement there, because again, the hostage family is now saying that only 4 of the 28 bodies are being released today. Does that sound as though it is a violation of the terms of the deal, or do we not fully know?
The details are yet to come out. Ultimately, what we do know about the nature of these deals is that oftentimes there are logistical concerns when it comes to transferring specifically bodies. So as we've heard is that, of course, the live hostages were able to return. But when it comes to the ones that are unfortunately have been deceased, it is more challenging at times to perhaps when it comes to the transport of the bodies, unfortunately, depending on where they were, because we also know that some hostages and some bodies were actually stored in the West Bank and not in Gaza. So it's a bit too early for us to assess whether this is in fact a violation. But what we do know is that so far the situation has been calm and the two sides have been working together, as we've seen with the recent summits.
And I do actually want to pop up a live look that we have over Hostage Square in Israel right now, where we do know that the 20 living hostages have returned. They have been released by Hamas, families, of course, gathering, and other folks who might be strangers. They might not know these hostages, but they wanted to show up here and pack Hostage Square in Tel Aviv to show their support. What message would you say that President Trump is hoping to send with his visit here to Israel, but also to Egypt?
Ultimately, the theme was very clear when you listen to President Trump's speech, was that ultimately the foreign policy agenda is peace through strength. And we've seen that in different arenas as well. It was not simply just the Israel-Palestine. As President Trump noted, the 8 or 7 different peace agreements that he was able to broker in the past few months, when we talk about the Caucasus of Azerbaijan and Armenia, or mostly in the West Asia region, we've seen that the idea is that, of course, they will leverage any form of military action for diplomatic means to have a diplomatic breakthrough. And that's what we've seen in recent years. But what you pointed out about the Hostage Square, it is extraordinary to see the Israeli civil society rejoicing finally after years. And politically speaking, of course, it's going to lift a lot of pressure from Netanyahu's administration currently that has been under fire for not returning the hostages. So we're seeing also a new wave of Israeli politics after this deal.
What stood out to you about what President Trump had to say during his speech there in the Knesset? He spoke for a little more than an hour, Netanyahu speaking just before him, talking for about 30 minutes there. So what overall stood out to you?
It was the main theme that not only are they focusing on the current I guess, socioeconomic and wartime developments in the region, but it has a vision for a few years ahead. So President Trump had a very key term that mentioned that, of course, talking to the Israelis, mentioning that you've been fighting really hard and we have supported you as the United States, but ultimately we would like to see the fruits of your labor, which would be a grand and expansion of the Abraham Accords. So the fact that the administration is still very focused on being able to ensure that Israel is able to maintain diplomatic ties, or at least broker new ties with our other allies in the region and hopefully around the world, that in itself says that, yes, of course, we have seen a lot of wars, but the idea is for us to expand beyond that and actually ensure diplomatic relations between our allies in West Asia.
What do you make of Prime Minister Netanyahu essentially praising Donald Trump and saying that he is the greatest friend that Israel has ever seen in the White House? We know that Netanyahu and President Biden had some disagreements. It appears that President Trump and Netanyahu are just a bit closer there. So what do you make of that statement overall?
Ultimately, it's indicative of the fact that under the Trump administration, we were able to focus on specifically what allies we have in common, but most importantly, who are shared enemies. So that was really a new wave when it comes to Israeli and American politics. When we talk about the new relationship that Jerusalem and Washington have, comes down to the shared enemies. One of them, of course, being the Islamic Republic of Iran, that they were able to, as the president noted, Operation Midnight Hammer, that he praised the name for, was ultimately us attacking and ensuring that our allies are safe, but most importantly, our interests are safe. And same goes for other Islamist groups in the region. Now we've established that any group in the Middle East that is oftentimes backed by Tehran, whether in this case being Hamas or Iraqi-backed militias, ultimately pose this threat to Israel and America. And for the two sides to be able to work on that and counter these threats collectively and bilaterally, that in itself secures U.S. personnel and U.S. interests in the region.
And what you're looking at are some of the live images that we do have coming in right now. This is out of Israel, of course, as we know that President Donald Trump is now headed over to Egypt for that signing ceremony. We should get some more comments from him, as well as other world leaders who are there. And we should be getting those live images coming up in just a bit. We also have this right here as those living hostages are returning to Israel. They are being transported over to medical centers there to be checked out before they are reunited with their families. One thing that stands out to me, and I wanted to get your take on this, the exchange here, it seems as though Hamas has kind of shifted gears here because they did agree to this and to release all of the remaining hostages. So what does this tell us about the current position and leverage that Hamas even has?
Ultimately, their leverage has been gradually diminishing throughout the last, I want to say, few months as Israel has intensified its campaigns and got reassurances from the United States. So the real pivotal point that went beyond just compelling Hamas and actually pressure these two allies for them to again double down and amplify the pressure on Hamas to ensure that we're able to at least find a short-term deal if it's not long-lasting. But again, you have to work step by step when you're dealing with such a sensitive war as we've identified it. So I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that we're able to leverage our different allies in this context, being able to fully compel Hamas and incentivize them to get the first phase in. Now, of course, knowing the nature of this terrorist group, they're very unlikely to voluntarily give up a lot of their power. So it's still going to be a delicate balance moving forward. But as we're talking about what leverage they have, it is certainly diminishing, and they're increasingly being backed a bit less by different Arab states in the region too, because Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey increasingly are pressuring Hamas to accept the deal so they can have a vision ahead and move forward with reconstruction of Gaza.
And you're seeing a lot of these aircraft that are landing, some of which are carrying the hostages. As I mentioned, they are going to be taken to hospitals, various medical centers in Israel to be checked out, then reunited with their families. So we do have these different live images and feeds that we are bringing you all throughout the morning into the evening as these do come in here. I want to ask you about Netanyahu and politics overall, because as the conflict appears to be winding down, what does all of this mean for Netanyahu, politically speaking?
We were seeing months and months of different protests on Hostage Square, trying to pressure Netanyahu's coalition to find and actually enact an agreement to bring the hostages home. And that has been the main driving factor of Israeli internal politics. Now, of course, that in itself might appear as one issue, but it's trickled down to different issues. Another angle being economic. Israel has been at war for, at this point, 2 years post-October 7th on different fronts. And that, of course, has economic implications for its populace, too. So this in itself, this breakthrough brokered by the United States should be able to lift a bit of a political pressure from Netanyahu's administration. Now, the question is, what is going to be the other key issue that they're going to tackle now that the hostages are home? Are they still going to discuss annexation of Gaza? Are they going to discuss dismantling, fully dismantling Hamas? Or are they going to pivot on their eastern borders, tackling more issues from the West Bank, more weapons being smuggled into from Jordan? So the precarious situation still persists for Israelis, but the main challenge has been resolved, which was the return of the hostages.
And one thing that's interesting here is we know that several big countries, especially European countries, kind of changed their view toward Israel and the way that they stood, their stance there over that 2-year period of the Gaza war. Do you think things start to return to we'll say, normal in that area, as normal as possible when you talk about the relationship between Israel and maybe some of its surrounding countries there, but also the European countries like, you know, Britain, the UK there, France, places that have said they are now going to recognize a Palestinian state. Does anything change?
It certainly does. And you're right to point out that Jerusalem diplomatic relations with these European countries is essential for Israeli geopolitics. Of course, the criticism has been that Israel, of course, is perhaps the military campaign is a bit excessive. But at this point, we've reached a very, very critical, I guess, cross point when we're talking about Israeli war in Gaza. The hostages have now returned, and the issue is not only on dismantlement. So, of course, if you're going to meet these demands set by the Europeans, that does pave the way for more positive relations between Israel and Europe. But, of course, it goes beyond just Gaza. Another angle that Europeans and Israelis have actually been more aligned was on the issue of Iran a few months back. So, Europeans actually were in favor of the United States and Israel targeting Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure. So to paint a picture, ultimately, Israel's relations with Europe has not necessarily been tainted because there's still other areas that they're working on. But the issue of Gaza particularly was of concern. And now hopefully with the aid trucks going into Gaza, and now there are more discussions of ceasefires. And now we've seen actually the celebrations on the streets of Gaza that the ceasefire has been reached. Hopefully we'll see a more positive light. We see this developments through a more positive light between Israel and Europe.
And you'll notice I'm keeping this on your screen because you can see the hostages being reunited with their families and friends. This is just one of the images we've seen, but you saw them kind of unfurl the Israeli flag there. But folks are now going to go into the hospital. Again, they will be checked out and then released to their family after they are checked out by the doctors there. My last question for you here is, what do we need to be watching for in the coming hours and the coming days?
Comes down to the keyword of dismantlement. This has been a word used when we're dealing with terrorist groups and sponsors of terrorism in the Middle East. When we discussed Islamic Republic of Iran, we talked about dismantlement of their nuclear program. As we talk about Hamas, we talk about them dismantling and effectively disarmament. We want them to give up their weapons. So that is the key term that we should be looking out for, whether Hamas actually agrees. The latest development has been the fact that Hamas has agreed to give up its weapons towards an entity, a bipartisan entity that resides in Egypt for the meantime. That is looking still positive. The details yet to come out, but ultimately what President Trump has really narrowed down and what Israelis agreed on is the fact that the mission currently in Gaza is ensure that Hamas gives up its weapons. And without that, we would just be back in an October 6th scenario where another horrendous terrorist attack could be on the horizon.
And what you're looking at there on your screen, left-hand side, that is Air Force One. We know that President Donald Trump is headed over to this location right now. He is going to fly over to Egypt. Now, I'm not sure how fast it's going to go, but I did check into it, and it looks like the average flight, if you're looking at Tel Aviv over to Egypt, the location where he is headed, about an hour and a half or so. So then he will take part in that peace plan ceremony, essentially. So we should be getting comments from him as that gets underway. But again, taking a live look right here at Air Force One as President Trump should be arriving there soon and then departing. Janatan, thank you so much, as always, for taking the time to be here with us and help break this down. There is so much to this, and we've seen a lot of developments over the past week or so. What else? Is there anything else that you want to add? Anything we missed before I let you go?
Of course. We discussed the issue of dismantling Hamas and disarmament, but another key term that we should be looking forward to, hopefully, is the expansion of the Abraham Accords. As you noted, President Trump actually going to Egypt and hosting numerous different delegations from around the world. That could pave the way for further normalization between Israel and other allies, and hopefully lead to more stability in the West Asia region. So this administration can add that to their resume as we speak.
On that note, as you mentioned Egypt, I did want to ask you here before we go, Egypt, why Egypt for this ceremony?
Because Egypt has had, number one is geopolitical. The fact that Egypt is stationed by the Gazan border, that allows them to have more leverage. They were able to host Hamas when it comes to the talks. They have their diplomatic relations. So that has been one angle. On the other angle, the fact that Egypt, again, Sisi has been a U.S. ally, the president, for since his tenure, really, since he started. So one, we have diplomatic relations with Egypt. But more important than all of that is the fact that Egypt has been very active in countering Islamic extremism, terrorist groups that threaten Israeli and American lives, as well as Egyptian. So they've been very, very vocal about addressing the Muslim Brotherhood. They've been tackling ISIS in their Sinai desert for months. So in addition to that, we're talking about an ally that, of course, is fighting the same enemies as we are, and is located in a very, very strategic location right by the Gaza. And of course, our diplomatic relations with Egypt has made this a prime partner for them to host the summit.
All right, Jonathan, thank you so much, as always, for being here with us. We definitely appreciate it.